The heat hung over Memphis like a heavy curtain, thick and oppressive. The sun scorched the pavement, making the air shimmer in waves above the cracked asphalt. It was the kind of afternoon where everything seemed to slow down, where the only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog too tired to do more than lift its head. 16-year-old Tiffany James stepped out of the small grocery store on the corner of Clark Avenue and 12th Street. The cold air from inside clung to her skin for a brief moment before the heat swallowed it whole. She adjusted the weight of the 2 paper bags in her arms, shifting them slightly for balance. Her mother had given her a short list of things to buy: milk, eggs, apples, and a loaf of bread. Nothing special, just enough to get them through the next couple of days. The summer stretched before her like an open road. She had just finished her junior year and was already making plans for her future. College was all she could think about, a place where she could finally focus on her passion for art. She had spent hours sketching in her notebook, imagining the designs she would one day bring to life. The thought made her smile as she walked, her sneakers tapping against the pavement. She decided to take the shortcut home, cutting through a narrow alley between 2 abandoned buildings. It was a path she had taken 100 times before, a quicker way to get back to the small apartment she shared with her mother. The alley was quiet, lined with overgrown weeds and old graffiti-covered walls. The scent of sun-baked asphalt mixed with the faint aroma of fried food from a nearby restaurant. Then, the first gunshot rang out. It was sharp, cracking through the stillness of the afternoon like a sudden clap of thunder. Tiffany froze for a fraction of a second, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. Another shot followed, then another. Shouting. The echo of footsteps pounding against the pavement. She turned her head just in time to see them, 2 groups of young men on either end of the alley, their hands gripping pistols, their faces twisted with adrenaline and rage. The Kingside Crew and the Glock Boys. Rival gangs locked in a war that had simmered beneath the surface for years. Tiffany's breath caught in her throat. Panic surged through her, but before she could react, before she could move, the gunfire exploded in every direction. The bullets ricocheted off brick walls, shattered glass from a nearby window, and tore through the air with a force that felt almost alive. One of them found her. The impact hit her chest like a hammer. The breath rushed out of her lungs, her legs gave way, and the world tilted sideways. The grocery bags slipped from her grasp, the carton of milk bursting open as it hit the ground, white liquid pooling over the hot pavement. Apples rolled in every direction, coming to a stop near the graffiti-covered walls. Her body crumpled onto the ground. The alley seemed to blur around her, the sounds of gunfire fading into something distant, almost unreal. The sky above remained the same brilliant blue, indifferent to what had just happened below. The shooters fled. Tires screeched in the distance as cars sped away. By the time the first sirens wailed through the neighborhood, the street was empty except for Tiffany's still form. The paramedics arrived, their hurried footsteps echoing through the alley. They checked for a pulse, but there was none. The bullet had done its job instantly, stealing away 16 years of life in a matter of seconds. Across town, Lorraine James was finishing up her shift at the diner when she got the call. She barely heard the words, but she knew. An hour later, a police officer knocked on her door. Her daughter was gone. Her only child. Her reason for everything. And the world kept moving, as if nothing had changed. The investigation moved quickly in the days following Tiffany's death. The city had seen its share of gang violence, but the killing of an innocent teenage girl in broad daylight put pressure on the police to act fast. Detectives combed through witness statements, security footage, and ballistics reports, piecing together the events of that deadly afternoon. Within a week, they had 2 names, Raymond Ray Carter, 22, and Jamal Hall, 19. Both were well known to law enforcement. Both were members of the Glock Boys. Carter had been arrested multiple times on weapons charges, but had never served more than a few months behind bars. Hall had a juvenile record for robbery and drug possession. Neither had steady employment, but both drove around in cars that didn't match their supposed incomes. Their names were whispered in the streets, associated with violence, extortion, and intimidation. The police were certain they had their shooters. They were arrested in coordinated raids, taken into custody without resistance. The media reported on their capture with bold headlines, painting them as ruthless criminals who had gunned down an innocent girl in the crossfire of their ongoing war. But the case that seemed airtight in the beginning began to unravel as soon as it reached the courtroom. The prosecution built its argument around witness testimony, ballistics evidence, and surveillance footage. But the witnesses were the first problem. Many of them lived in the neighborhood and knew what happened to people who talked. A few who initially agreed to testify later recanted, claiming they hadn't seen anything clearly. Others simply refused to show up in court. The fear in the community was stronger than the pursuit of justice. The surveillance footage was grainy and unclear. The camera's position near the alley captured flashes of movement, muzzle flashes, and bodies ducking for cover, but they did not provide a clear view of who fired the fatal shot. The prosecution had no conclusive proof that the bullet that struck Tiffany had come from Carter's or Hall's gun. The defense attorneys, paid for by unknown sources, exploited every weakness in the case. They questioned the reliability of the remaining witnesses, pointing out inconsistencies in their statements. They highlighted the lack of direct forensic evidence. They argued that the gunfire had come from multiple directions and that their clients had simply been caught in the chaos. The judge excluded certain pieces of evidence, ruling that they were circumstantial. The defense attorneys cast doubt on every argument the prosecution presented, shifting the narrative from a gang-related murder to a tragic accident with no clear perpetrator. In February 2006, the verdict came down. Insufficient evidence. Charges dismissed. Lorraine sat in the courtroom, gripping a photograph of Tiffany so tightly that the edges curled beneath her fingers. She barely heard the words of the judge, but she saw the reaction in the room. The mother of Ray Carter let out a relieved sigh, pressing a hand to her chest. Carter himself smirked as he turned to leave, his eyes sweeping over the courtroom like he had just won a game. Jamal Hall walked out right behind him, shaking hands with his lawyer, his face calm. The system had failed. That night, Lorraine sat at her small kitchen table, surrounded by newspaper clippings. Some were from the week of Tiffany's death, detailing the tragedy, the community outrage, and the calls for justice. Others were from the past few months, documenting the arrests, the trial, and finally, the dismissal of all charges. She read them all, again and again, absorbing every detail. She did not cry. She thought. The years that followed were marked by quiet transformation. By day, Lorraine James remained the same dedicated nurse she had always been. She clocked in for long shifts at the city hospital, tending to patients with steady hands and a calm demeanor. Her co-workers saw her as resilient, a woman who had endured unimaginable loss but refused to let it break her. She never spoke about the trial, never mentioned the names of the men who had walked free. To those around her, it seemed that she had chosen to move forward, to bury her grief beneath the steady rhythm of work and routine. But beneath the surface, another Lorraine was taking shape. She spent her nights reading. At first, it was law books borrowed from the public library, volumes on criminal procedure, evidentiary rules, and legal loopholes. Then came forensic science, ballistics, toxicology. She learned about crime scene investigation, the ways cases were built and, more importantly, how they fell apart. She studied cold cases, searching for patterns in how killers evaded justice. Her world expanded beyond books. She attended trials at the courthouse, sitting in the back, observing how attorneys maneuvered, how witnesses crumbled under cross-examination. She listened to radio segments about corruption in law enforcement, followed investigative reports on flawed prosecutions. Over time, she began to make connections. She befriended a crime journalist who had covered Tiffany's case, asking him questions about other unsolved murders and the inner workings of Memphis gangs. She struck up conversations with defense attorneys at local bars, feigning casual interest in their cases while absorbing every detail they shared. She met former convicts, men who had served time and come out bitter, eager to talk about the system that had chewed them up and spit them out. Each interaction gave her something new, a piece of knowledge, an insight, a name. She learned to listen in places most people ignored. Underground fight clubs, backroom poker games, dingy bars where criminals felt comfortable speaking freely. She kept a low profile, never asking too many questions, never drawing attention to herself. She blended into the background, just another quiet woman nursing a drink, seemingly out of place, but never suspicious enough to warrant concern. That was how she learned what had become of Raymond Carter and Jamal Hall. By 2007, Carter had risen through the ranks of the Glock Boys, taking control of their drug operations in South Memphis. He was no longer just a foot soldier, he was making real money, calling shots, deciding who lived and who died. Hall remained at his side, his enforcer, the one who handled problems before they could become real threats. They moved through the city like they owned it, untouched by law enforcement, protected by fear and silence. The people they terrorized were the same people who refused to testify against them, the same ones who had turned their backs on Lorraine in court. Carter and Hall believed they were untouchable. Lorraine knew better. Nothing lasted forever. By the spring of 2009, Lorraine was ready. Every moment leading up to this had been spent in careful preparation. She had studied crime, justice, and the ways in which men like Carter and Hall slipped through the cracks. She had learned patience, discipline, and how to disappear into the background. She understood that true vengeance wasn't about rage, it was about precision. If she acted out of anger, if she let emotion guide her, she would fail. This had to look natural, inevitable, like just another casualty in a world where men like them never lasted long. She had spent months gathering information, watching, listening. She followed routines, memorized schedules, took note of their habits. Carter and Hall moved carefully, always aware that enemies could be lurking, but Lorraine was not the kind of enemy they expected. Jamal Hall was the first. She had learned that every Friday night, he went to an illegal gambling club hidden inside a condemned building on the east side of the city. The place had no sign, no official entrance. Only those who knew about it could find their way inside. It was run by a small-time gangster who didn't ask questions as long as the money flowed. Hall was a regular. He arrived late, stayed for hours, and drank more than he should. Lorraine had waited for the right moment. She spent weeks observing the club, learning how people entered and exited, noting when security was lax. She found out who worked the bar, how drinks were served, how the money moved. The place was lawless, unregulated, filled with criminals who would never call the police if something went wrong. One night, she made her move. Hall had been drinking heavily, laughing too loudly, caught up in a winning streak at one of the tables. Lorraine blended into the background, unnoticed. She moved with quiet efficiency, slipping through the crowd without drawing attention. When the moment was right, when Hall was distracted, she made a simple exchange, one glass for another. The liquid in his drink looked no different, smelled no different. The substance she had used was undetectable, something she had spent months researching, something that mimicked a natural heart attack. Hall never saw her. Less than an hour later, he stumbled out of the club, his breath uneven, his steps uncertain. No one paid much attention. Men like him drank too much all the time. He made it as far as the alley behind the building before his body seized. He clutched his chest, gasping, collapsing to the ground as his heart gave out. By the time someone found him, he was already gone. The police arrived, took a brief look at the scene, and drew their own conclusions. A man with a criminal record, drinking heavily in an illegal gambling den, found dead in an alley. There were no signs of struggle, no visible wounds, nothing to suggest foul play. The toxicology report came back clean, no drugs, no poison, only a dangerously high blood alcohol level. They marked it as an overdose, a fatal reaction to a bad mix of liquor. No one questioned it. Raymond Carter understood what had happened. He didn't know how, didn't know why, but he knew that Hall's death wasn't an accident. He tightened security, moved more carefully, kept his inner circle small. He carried a gun at all times, doubled the men who watched his back. But Lorraine wasn't finished. She waited. By the summer of 2010, Raymond Carter was a man living on borrowed time. The war between the Glock Boys and a rival gang had escalated into something relentless, a cycle of violence that consumed the streets of Memphis. Every week brought new bloodshed. Bodies turned up in alleys, bullets shattered the quiet of the night, and Carter was at the center of it all. He had enemies on every side, and he knew it. Paranoia had become his constant companion. He moved differently now, never staying in one place for too long, never trusting anyone completely. He changed vehicles often, switched up his routines, avoided old haunts where too many people knew his face. He carried 2 guns at all times and rarely went anywhere without at least 2 men watching his back. But no amount of caution could protect him from what he never saw coming. One humid night in late August, Carter left a meeting at a club on the outskirts of the city. It was just past 2 in the morning, and the air was thick with the scent of asphalt and exhaust. He was alone, an unusual occurrence, but he had insisted. He wanted to clear his head, to drive without anyone talking in his ear. His black Chevrolet Impala cut through the darkness as he sped down the empty stretch of highway leading back into the city. He never noticed the small pool of brake fluid beneath his car before he left the parking lot. He didn't sense anything was wrong until he hit the curve near the old overpass. He pressed the brake pedal, expecting resistance, expecting the car to slow. Instead, the pedal sank all the way to the floor with no response. The vehicle continued forward at high speed, barreling toward the guardrail. He yanked the wheel, but it was too late. The Impala slammed into the concrete barrier at 70 miles per hour, the impact crushing the front end, sending the car into a violent spin before it flipped. The sound of screeching metal and shattering glass filled the night. The explosion came seconds later. A fireball lit up the highway as flames consumed what remained of the car. Thick black smoke curled into the air, carrying the scent of burning rubber and gasoline. The distant wail of sirens cut through the silence as emergency responders rushed to the scene. By the time they arrived, there was nothing left to save. The police conducted a routine investigation. They found that the brake lines had been cleanly severed. But in Carter's world, this wasn't unusual. He had made too many enemies, crossed too many people. Sabotage was expected. The case was filed away as another consequence of gang life, an inevitable end to a man who had outlived his luck. No one looked deeper. No one suspected anything more. On the overpass above, Lorraine stood in the shadows, watching the flames flicker against the night sky. The heat from the fire reached her even from a distance, but she didn't move. She inhaled slowly, letting the thick air fill her lungs, then exhaled just as calmly. The sirens grew louder. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in her dark eyes. She turned and walked away. There was nothing left to feel. In the months that followed, Lorraine James returned to her life as if nothing had changed. She woke up early, dressed in her neatly pressed uniform, and went to work at the hospital. She moved through the hallways with the same quiet determination, tending to patients with steady hands and a gentle voice. Her co-workers noticed nothing different. To them, she was the same woman she had always been, kind, reliable, composed. The city moved on. Raymond Carter's death was just another headline, another name added to the long list of casualties in Memphis' ongoing gang wars. The police didn't spend much time investigating. His enemies were many, and any number of them could have wanted him dead. There were whispers of revenge, of retaliation, but without a clear suspect, the case faded into the background. No one suspected Lorraine. Except for one man. Detective Ronald Berkeley had been the lead investigator in Tiffany's case back in 2005. He had watched Lorraine sit silently in the courtroom as Carter and Hall walked free. He had seen the way she clenched her jaw, the way her eyes never left them as they exited the courthouse. He had filed the case away like everyone else, accepting that justice had slipped through the cracks. But now, something felt wrong. He hadn't thought about Lorraine James in years, but when he read about Carter's death, something nagged at him. It wasn't just Carter. It was Jamal Hall before him. A man with no history of health problems suddenly collapsing from an apparent heart attack. A gang leader losing control of his vehicle in a perfectly timed accident. It could have been coincidence. But Berkeley had spent too many years in homicide to believe in coincidences. He started looking into their deaths, tracing back their final days. He combed through reports, examined timelines, searched for anything unusual. The deeper he looked, the more he felt that an unseen hand had guided these events. Someone patient, methodical, careful. There were no direct links, no clear evidence. Whoever had done this had made sure of that. But when he knocked on Lorraine's door one evening, he saw the truth in her eyes before she even spoke. She didn't ask why he was there. She didn't invite him in. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. He had no warrant, no case, no hard proof. He couldn't arrest her. He couldn't even accuse her. He only said 2 words. "I understand." She didn't respond. He left without another word. In the years that followed, Lorraine continued to live her life. She worked at the hospital, volunteered in community programs, helped young women from troubled backgrounds. She became a figure of quiet strength, admired for her resilience. No one ever knew what she had done. No one, perhaps, except Berkeley. But every morning, when she looked in the mirror, she saw the truth reflected back at her. She was no longer the woman she had been. Her story was never told. Her justice was never questioned. And for the first time in 15 years, she felt at peace.